thanks everyone so much for joining for our webinar today. So this is called It's Payback Time, Practical Steps to Repayment of Recruitment Fees as Remedy for Forced Labour. And today we'll be looking at the issue of recruitment fees in general with a deep dive into Malaysia more specifically. So you're hosted today by myself, Ben Bostock, and my colleague Rosie Hurst, with a special guest, Mike Scaglione from WRP, who'll be speaking a little bit later. So before I hand over to Rosie, I've just got a few housekeeping things to go over. So firstly, this webinar is being recorded, just so that you're aware. So this will be available to any colleagues or friends afterwards. Confidentiality, we're going to refrain from using most client names other than those which are already in the public domain. Webcams, if you could please keep them off, then no one will have to realize that you're still in your pajamas. Mute, if everyone could please remain on mute throughout this, because questions, we will welcome them, but if you can please write the questions into the chat function, just as and when they come up, then my colleague Ali will be able to collate these into themes and groups and ask them at the end for the most efficient way possible for us to get through as many as we can. And if yours doesn't manage to get answered in the time, then please just drop us an email afterwards at info@impactlimited.com, and we'll try and answer that following the presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Rosie.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Delighted to see so many people on the call and really impressed to see so many people from the East joining us today. It looks like we have a great group of people with different interests in this topic, and so I hope that we will be able to keep you all interested. Anyway, first of all, just to introduce Impactt. Impactt has been working for 23 years now to make what works for workers work for business. So what we aim to do is to identify where there are issues with workers in the global supply chain, and then support our clients, who can be retailers or brands or organizations or employers, to sort everything out so that that is better for business and better for workers. And we have a great deal of experience globally, but today we're going to be talking especially about labour migration from countries in South and Southeast Asia into other countries in Southeast Asia, and maybe a couple of bits of sidebars about the Middle East as well. Next slide, please, Ben. So let's just cut to the chase. What is forced labour? I'm sure everybody on the call knows these definitions already. And I have to say, I personally find them extremely unhelpful and very, very unintuitive, actually. So all work or service that is exacted from any person under the threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. And here's the Ilo definition and the US Department of Homeland Security definition. Ben, perhaps you could move on a little. Next slide. Perhaps much easier to understand are the ILO forced labour indicators, and these are the indicators which we use in order to identify forced labour. And as you can see here, there are 11 of them. And they range from things that always mean forced labour, so debt bondage, things like the retention of ID documents, through things like restriction of movement, withholding wages, deception, onto other issues which may indicate forced labour but don't necessarily mean that there is forced labour. So abusive living and working conditions, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, isolation and excessive overtime. Now, Ben, I was just going to bring you in here and just ask you just to comment a bit about the sort of findings we've had looking at these forced labour indicators in our field work.
Thanks, Rosie. So generally in our field work, we will find evidence of all of these forced labour indicators to a varying level of severity depending on where we are. So, for example, in Malaysia, across 10s, 20s of factories that we visited, We have found evidence of all of these, but most prominent have been debt bondage and abusive living and working conditions across the country. In the Middle East, it's been similar, though perhaps abusive living and working conditions a bit less so, but there have been more historical issues of retention of identity documents and withholding of wages.
And of course, the vulnerable people we're talking about here are almost exclusively in these contexts foreign migrants who have come from overseas to work in a richer country and who find themselves vulnerable to all of these indicators. Ben, next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context actually for the events which have prompted this particular webinar. So funnily enough, the US Tariff Act dates back to 1930. So in 1930, the US prohibited the importation of merchandise made by forced or indentured labor, including forced child labor. And this was not very much enforced for many years. It was only really in 2015 when the tail end of the Obama administration, they repealed what they called the Consumptive Demand Clause. So up until 2015, you couldn't import stuff made with forced labor into the US unless the US really needed it. Now, after 2015, that unless the US really needed it was struck out. So that means whether or not the US really needs it, it is illegal to import goods made by forced labor. And very interestingly, that gateway opened by the Obama administration has been very much used far more often by the Trump administration, as we'll see. Can you flip into the next slide, please? So under this act, the US Customs and Border Protection Group can withhold goods at the borders of the United States of America, which it believes have been made with forced labor. Not only that, but they can levy civil or criminal penalties on companies importing such goods. And this, of course, has impacts not only on suppliers and manufacturers, but also on retailers. It also has effect on US government and UN purchasing bodies based in the US, who also find themselves falling athwart of this legislation. So let's look at how often this has actually been used. And it's quite interesting. We just sort of hopped onto the website a little while ago, and we saw that it hadn't really been much used at all until terribly recently. And what's interesting here is we see that the little red hammers are about sectoral bans. So all cotton from Uzbekistan, for example. And that has only really started happening since 1998. But in 2019, there was a massive boom in WROs, one of which was against our colleague, Mike Scaglione, who's on this call, who's going to be speaking to us later about what it's actually like when this happens to you. And I think that personal experience is going to be very useful for a lot of people on this call. And this year, even with COVID and everything else, and bearing in mind we're only in July, there have been 4, 2 in China, 1 in Malaysia, on the leading glove manufacturing company, Top Glove, and 1 somewhere else, I can't at the moment call to mind. So can we slip on to the next slide? Yeah. Now, of course, there's been a lot of publicity about forced labour, increasing publicity over recent years. It does appear that forced labour is in general on the increase globally, sadly. I mean, 23 years ago, we didn't see much of it. Now we see a great deal of it. And what we're seeing now is a move towards remedy. So this means not just trying not to recruit forced labour, but also trying to work out how to recompense those, indeed as it is, millions of people who have lost out because of having paid recruitment fees. And we see here, top left, Apple requires suppliers to repay $616,000 US in recruitment fees, which is part of a total sum of $30.9 million since 2008. I mentioned Top Glove last week. They received a withhold release order. They can't import into the US. And also now they they are now considering how they can repay in order to get that WRO lifted and get their business moving again. So Glovemaker at WRP to reimburse recruitment fees paid by workers. Mike will be telling us more about how that actually happened. And then finally, in Qatar, workers working building the World Cup stadiums are getting are actually well through getting a $30 million payout. Can we have the next slide, please? So Ben, I'd like you to just chat for a little bit about workers' priorities here. So workers who find themselves in this position, when we talk to them, and we've talked to tens of thousands of them, what do they tend to say to us about their priorities? Because we have to remember that if we're going to remedy this situation, we have to make sure that the workers' wishes are at the centre of whatever we do.
Thanks, Rosie. So all of the workers that we've interviewed this year have told us that income is either their top priority or within their top 3 priorities. So we see some of the quotes from workers here about knowing how much money they will receive, when they will receive it, and actually just earning enough money to support their families back home. This year as well, priorities were safety and hygiene around COVID, and some workers mentioned accommodation, but by far and away, the most common, in fact, unanimous thing that was reported was that income was the top priority.
Yeah, and I think that's very important when we think about what does remedy mean. So if we think about how you go about cancelling forced labour, it's not just about looking to the future and looking to how to make sure that no more people are hired under these difficult circumstances. It's also about looking to the past to make sure that wrongs are righted. And so if you ask workers what they feel the wrong is that they've experienced, it is about the money. It's about not knowing at the time when they made the decisions how much they were going to have to pay and how hard it was going to be to pay that money back to whoever they borrowed it from. Next slide, please. Ben, over to you now to talk a little bit more about how this whole thing happens in the first place.
Absolutely. So to highlight this issue with money, we have to go back to the recruitment journey. Many of you will already know roughly what the recruitment journey looks like, coming from labor source countries into destination countries. So an example of such a journey might be from Bangladesh or Nepal into areas like Malaysia or the Middle East. Those are just 2 areas of particular focus for ourselves. So to briefly go through this, the workers may hear about a job at whether it's at a rubber glove factory or a technology company or indeed construction in the Middle East. They may hear about this through an advert in the newspaper or indeed word of mouth from their friends or their cousin in the village. Already that friend or cousin may be taking a sum of money from them to guarantee that they get that job. And so on and so forth. There may be more and more sub-agents beneath the recruitment agency that takes money off the top every time. There's also opportunities for corruption along this recruitment journey beyond these additional fees that are being charged. So there may be corruption involved with passports, visas, and the like. So many opportunities for exploitation before a worker has even got on the plane to go to their destination country. And for more details and to read a bit more about this, you can visit the UK government modern slavery statement, for which we inputted this particular diagram of a worker recruitment journey. So what does this look like in terms of actual quantum of fees paid? So these figures come from a sample of over 1,500 workers in Malaysia, particularly across 11 factories. What you'll immediately notice is the figure for Bangladeshi workers is astronomically higher than the other nationalities. That said, the other nationalities still pay a hell of a lot of money. So this is actually common with a number of destination countries, that this differential will always be there. So the Bangladeshis always tend to pay the highest amount. And that can range as high as $5,000 or $6,000 in some cases. These are just average figures. So to also highlight the case with Indonesian workers, this is interesting. An interesting recent finding that we've been discovering is that a lot of Indonesian workers are paying a huge amount of money retrospectively. So after their recruitment journey has finished and they've actually started their jobs, they're still paying money either above board or rather in the knowledge of their companies. So it's coming out of their salaries every month, or they'll be paying it off their own back from their own income separately without their company's knowledge, and they're paying it to their recruitment agencies back in their home country. And this is because these recruitment agencies will be holding on to their personal documents and they won't release them until they've paid off a certain amount of money, which can range from about 400 to 800 US dollars, something in that region. So whilst a lot of the fees are paid in the recruitment journey, some are still actually taken from workers after they've already started their jobs. So what are the solutions then? Attempting to develop zero-cost recruitment as a first stage simply doesn't work. That's what we've been finding in the past couple of years. A lot of companies will have what's called a zero-cost recruitment policy, but by itself, this has been ineffective so far. It's a nice thing to commit to, and they may sign up to things like the employer pays principle, but in practice, it doesn't really prevent the problem from happening in future with future recruitment, as agencies are just finding new loopholes to get around this. So for example, some agencies are making workers have videos where they testify that they haven't paid anything in recruitment fees. Others are having them sign documents. So this actually exacerbates coercion and intimidation by these agencies because there's even more pressure on them to show that their workers have not paid recruitment fees in inverted commas, i.e. more pressure to coerce those workers into lying about the recruitment fees that they have paid. So what we do find is that when reimbursement, so a big remediation bill, is the first step to repay historic fees, this incentivizes companies to actually ensure that those zero cost policies and procedures are done properly. So an example of this is a confidential project we were working on with a clothing manufacturer in Malaysia. $500,000 was paid back in remediation payments for historic fees. Following this, the policies and procedures around prevention, so around zero cost recruitment, actually led to a reduction in recruitment fees paid from around $1,000 per worker to about $200 per worker. This itself, ideally, of course, you'd have $0 being paid, but a figure like that is genuinely unrealistic at this stage. And if companies are reporting figures of absolute zero cost, that's actually a big alarm bell. So low cost is more credible at the moment than zero cost. So what should be being done is when these low costs are found, is that those are remediated on case-by-case bases to slowly improve and bring that down to zero cost in future. But for now, having a big remediation bill to open a company's eyes to the problem will generally make them implement really good and effective prevention measures. So what is an option for remediation? Our proposed solution, which we've used in a number of places around the world, is called universal payment. So this is a straightforward approach to reimbursement. The amounts of payments made to workers are based on the average quantum reported by workers during an investigation. Ideally, this would be in person, and this would be done by worker interviewers of the same nationality with fluent linguistic skills so that workers can speak in their mother tongue. At the moment, it's difficult to travel, and so there is possibility to do this remotely via Skype and Zoom investigations with helplines on the side and with options for individual WhatsApp calls or WeChat or things like that. Those can then be verified in person at a future visit. The second thing to consider in universal payments is how the payments are split. So generally, we say that these should be split by nationality, because as you saw a few slides ago, some nationalities pay a lot of money compared to a lot more money compared to others. And so splitting it by nationality, we find, is the fairest way to do it. So this will be cross-checked with data from other companies that we visit. So we've been building up data sets over the past few years of perhaps 11 or 12 companies in Malaysia so far, and aggregating the averages reported. And what's interesting is that it's always remarkably similar. It's very rare to get serious anomalies or outliers, and all workers have gone through remarkably similar amounts of illicit fees that they've had to pay on their recruitment journey. We'll also validate these compared with figures from the ILO or other reputable organizations as they're released. And that helps us gain a stronger picture of how much each different nationality is paying on average. Generally, we also require that all migrant workers employed at the date of discovery of the issue are eligible, regardless of their length of service, current debt status, or ability to produce receipts. This is extremely important. So it's going to be extremely rare that any worker has any evidence that they have paid recruitment fees. And this plays perfectly into the recruitment agency's hands. Indeed, they will not provide receipts, and they will make sure that workers will pay them in cash so that there's no evidence. So therefore, we need to assure that receipts are not required for this kind of payment. So to go through some examples, in the construction sector in Qatar, we work with the Supreme Committee on Delivery and Legacy, who contract construction companies to build the stadiums for the FIFA 2022 World Cup. And there we've supported them to deliver the Supreme Committee Universal Reimbursement Scheme, shortened to SCURS. And this has 120 or more companies now committed to repaying 30 million US dollars to roughly 45,000 workers. And this has shown a feeling of respect amongst the workers, increasing by 24% across the time that we've been assisting them as external monitor. And just speaking to the workers this year, you can tell just how much happier they are due to the increase in income, not only due to the increase in income, but knowing what that increase is for. The ones who really understand that the extra income is being received because of historic unethical recruitment, those are the ones who you really see the increased respect and satisfaction levels in our surveys. And secondly, the manufacturing and retail sectors in Malaysia, we've supported various companies towards 9.3 million in total. So that's about 3.5 million in retail, the rest in manufacturing. That's been committed across 4 companies that we've supported. And we feel that there is much, much more to follow soon in Malaysia in terms of remediation payments coming up. And just to highlight a few of these worker comments, workers have been extremely happy about these payment commitments. So saying that their family is so happy, the surprise they go through, and how energized they feel to work for these companies who finally recognize the hardship that they've been through in their recruitment journey. So to summarize, some quick do's and don'ts. So do always consider all workers in scope, and certainly don't leave any groups out. Do include workers whose contract ends. So if a worker has been working for you for 5 years, 3 years, however long, and their contract is about to end in 2 months, just after you've started paying universal payments, they should absolutely still be included. This worker is the responsibility. It's financially, the worker is financially dependent on the company. And so all historic fees paid relate to the company as well. So they should absolutely be within scope. And finally, beware of coercion and intimidation. So as we mentioned during the recruitment journey, it's in the recruitment agency's best interests to coerce and intimidate workers into lying about the fees that they've paid so that the recruitment agencies don't get in trouble. And that's very important to spot during worker interviews. So don't make receipts a requirement. As I mentioned, this will be very rare that workers have any proof of paying these illicit payments. Don't believe video or written proof. For the same reason, recruitment agencies will want to hand over this evidence in order to please auditors, to lie to them about what's going on. Don't consider only those in debt. So the term debt bondage can actually be slightly misleading because this may only consider those workers that are still actually in debt, where some workers may have paid a lot of money, may have borrowed a lot of money, but also sold things like family assets. And so weren't technically in debt or have paid off their debt quite quickly because they sold off assets, but really they've faced the same financial hardship, but it just is continuing to manifest in a slightly different way. So considering only those in debt can leave out a lot of vulnerable workers who have been through the exact same scenario and should be owed the exact same amount of money as their friends from the same country. And don't feign ignorance. Above all else, your workforce is your responsibility. So we can say with a lot of assurity that many destination countries which source labor from labor source countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, that we highlighted on the previous slides, this will be virtually unanimous that all of these workers have paid recruitment fees. So over to Rosie and Mike to speak about a little bit about the WRP situation.
Thank you very much, Ben. I am delighted to introduce Mike Scaglione, who comes to us from the, I don't know what to call it, the bleeding edge of this work. So Mike is the US representative of WRP, the glove company against which CBP raised a WRO, withhold release order, last year. Mike, happily working as the VP Sales and Marketing in the US, not really concerned with the labor side of things at all. One day he woke up to some news. Mike, would you like to tell us how you first found out about the WRO?
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Ben. Okay, so WRP is a glove manufacturer in Malaysia. We've been doing this for about 30 years. We have typically between 2,000 to 3,000 foreign workers on our site. It's a labor-intensive industry. It's difficult to get Malays to work in the industry, so we bring in foreign workers. We often have, and we were running along just fine. We were accustomed to frequent audits from customers and third parties over the last 10 years, social responsibility audits, people that are coming in to check to make sure all of the boxes are ticked on the social responsibility requirements. Typically they'd find nonconformities, we'd fix the nonconformity, pass the audit and go on. And we've passed many, many audits and didn't think anything was a problem. And then I came to work one day, a customer calls me and says, Mike, we have containers stuck in customs, stuck at the port. They won't release it because you're on customs hold. And I really had no idea what they're talking about. I'd never heard of customs hold before, didn't know what a WRO was. So we immediately called the lawyers. The lawyers started making phone calls, and then they verified that we are on WRO. What did it mean to us? It took us actually a couple weeks to realize what it even meant to us. We found out that what it really meant was that 100% of our product could not pass through customs from that day forward. And we had well over 100 40-foot containers, either at the port or on the water. All of them got stuck at the port. The various port directors would not release them. And the communication with CPB, it actually took us several weeks to find out who the people were at CPB to even talk to. We found out that the port directors had discretion on how they handled things. we decided to move these containers to bonded warehouses because we figured we'd get off the WR within a couple weeks, just like the new folks on this in the situation are thinking now. And we just parked these containers at bonded warehouses. We had a lot of customers who had paid for these containers already or partially paid, and we had to deal with their complaints about the money they've owed. Our customers also were the importers of this product, so they were responsible for getting these containers out of customs, paying the demurrage, paying for the bonded warehouses, and so forth. We had to stop all of our production. We actually continued to ship for a few weeks until we realized that's a really bad idea. We're just pouring money down the hole. So we stopped shipping. Then we found out that the port directors wouldn't allow our containers to go to the bonded warehouses. They had to do inspections. They had to do paperwork. Many of them wouldn't answer phone calls. They'd write to us and say, we only work with email. And you write them an email and they wouldn't answer you back. And you'd call them and they say, we don't accept phone calls. So it was just infuriating to try to move these containers around. And like I say, well over 100. Then we found out there's not enough bonded warehouse capacity in the United States to handle even our business, which isn't Apple or Microsoft. It's a glove manufacturing business. So we couldn't find a place to put these containers. So we were storing containers at the ports for $500 to $1,000 per day. The fees racked up very, very quickly. Our legal fees increased very quickly. Our revenue, about half of our revenue comes from the United States. So we were immediately cut in half as a company. And trying to get off the WRO with customs headquarters was also challenging. It took us a long time to find out who the players are, what they wanted. And they told us straight out, we cannot give you a list of what you need to do to solve this problem. You have to present the information on what you've done, and we'll review it, and then we'll get back to you. And each cycle of review could take weeks or months. So all in all, we were on this for 6 months. And even up to the very last day, we had no idea what our timeline was. We had no idea whether we fulfilled all the obligations. We were just ticking every single box. We, of course, did end up remediating all of our workers, and Impactt helped us with that.
Thanks, Mike. So suddenly reality bit, and there was no rule book. I mean, this is, I think, what's the most frightening thing about it, that you're not given any instruction about what to do. So what kind of evidence did CBP require?
CBP never told us what evidence they required.
What did they accept in the end, do you think?
So what we did was, and like I said, we had a lot of audits over the years. We put together all of those audits into a very large packet, hundreds of pages, off to CBP. We studied all of the indicators of forced labor. We tried to make sure that all of our audits addressed every single one of the areas of forced labor. We submitted those, and it took them a very long time to review them. We'd call and ask, and their answer was, our legal team is reviewing it. Getting into some of the details, it had to do with passport control. That was an issue that we round about. We have, imagine with 2,500 workers on your property, and passport theft and loss is a big problem. We kept our passports in a secure room. People could access those passports if they wanted to, but they were locked up so that anybody couldn't just walk in there and rummage through all the passports. We found out that was not acceptable. You had to have them available. We had to buy thousands of lockers, individual safety deposit box type lockers, and put the passports in there and give everybody a key. And then we found out because that room was locked, that wasn't acceptable. The room had to be unlocked. So a lot of really tiny details like that. We had a process for workers leaving the grounds, because sometimes you bring the workers in for their morning shift and you'd be missing 10 of them and you don't know where they are. So you'd go to the list of who left the grounds before, find out if they've ever came back, did they check back in? If they didn't check back in, then you start checking around the hospitals, the jails, or wherever you think they might be. That entire process was unacceptable. tracking when they left the grounds or not was not acceptable. So we learned all of these things the very difficult way, and just kept submitting audit results, improvements, zero recruitment policies. We created a lot of new policies in the process, and kept submitting that to CBP, and their answer was, no, you're not released yet. We need more. Well, what do you need? Well, we can't tell you what we need. So it was an infuriating process.
And in the end, do you think it was the repayment of recruitment fees that was the biggest sticking point?
At the very, very end, and I'm talking several weeks prior to the release, we were told by the various staff at CPB that there was 3 or 4 more things that they wanted. And I did ask them what those were. She told me, once again, she's not allowed to say. I ended up getting on the phone with the director of forced labor at CBP, and she did tell me that we need a recruitment reimbursement policy from you. In addition, we need you to hire a third-party audit to verify these fees, to determine what the fees need to be. We need your schedule. We need indication that you're on schedule every 6 months or so. Once we submitted all of that, and right about then, COVID was also occurring. I think that might have bumped us a week or 2 faster than we would have been off, but we did finally get a list from them of what we needed, and we submitted it. And yes, a big part of it was recruitment fees, which was an enormous number for us. If I look at Ben's number about how much has been paid in Malaysia, we're more than half of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for a company that had already been strangled of 50% of its sales for 6 months, so it's been tough.
And not only that, here we are. We were let off March 24th, and now we're roughly 4 months away from that. We still haven't booked any revenue, because after the WRO is over, then you call all of your customers and say it's over now. Then they start putting in their orders, and so 30 days later the orders are in. Then you have to manufacture it, which takes 60 days. Then you have to ship it. So we're just now getting containers in the water. So we're going to be losing close to a year's worth of revenue on this.
Yeah, which is quite. I mean, it's so kind of you to come on this call to talk about it, because I think it's rare that people who've had this experience are willing to share it. And I think what we hear from that is it's very, very, very serious. Working with your Malaysian colleagues on trying to having thought at the beginning that there was nothing much wrong, what were the big difficulties you faced in trying to kind of reconcile the international view and the Malaysian view?
Well, the foreign worker, the frequency of companies over there using foreign workers is so great. It's a bit cultural in Malaysia to use a lot of foreign workers. I noticed Ben's point, feigning ignorance. There's a lot of feigning ignorance going on over there. So most of the glove companies, from what we've heard, the construction industry, the oil industry, a lot of them using foreign workers. And as far as we know, we're the only company over there that's gone through this process and paid the remediation. A second glove company was put on WRO last week, and I don't think they understand yet what's in front of them, but I'm sure they're going to learn very quickly. But this is very common practice in Malaysia, and the management over there, not just WRP's management, but the management of all the glove companies, they know what's going on. They saw what went through what WRP went through, and they still haven't started writing checks for their workers. So we did complain to CPB that it was a very uneven playing field. Why was WRP selected and nobody else was? Of course, we never got an answer. I think that things are going to start rapidly changing there culturally. When I say culturally, I'm talking about the business mindset of the management over there will start realizing that it's much better in the long term financially to get this fixed up than not get this fixed up.
Yeah, and I think, and thank you for sharing so openly, because many people would try and pretend it wasn't that bad, but it was, I mean, we were talking to each other throughout. It was bad. And thanks, Mike, for that. And there's plenty of opportunities to ask questions of Mike and of me and Ben. And my colleague Ali is manning the chat line. So just type something into the chat if there are, and I can see we've had quite a few questions already. But Mike, we'll just move on now, unless there's anything else you want to add in, any burning things you'd like to add at this point.
No, we're very happy to be off WRO. Personally, I actually feel a lot better from it. You know, just from a morality standpoint, I'm very glad that we took care of our workers, and I'm very glad that we're leading the industry now on this whole aspect of manufacturing. So it was a very, very tough lesson to learn, but I feel really good about where we are now. So we're happy with the process now that it's over.
Yeah. And of course, we can say that workers are receiving money and they are utterly delighted by this.
They've already received money. We have had the feedback from the workers, similar comments to what Ben put up on the quotes. They're very happy. Some were moved to tears. It was very touching to hear some of the comments that they made once they got their first check.
Absolutely. No, it means suddenly you hit, after all this sort of economic horror, you hit the human bit, and that, as you say, it feels good. So just to wrap up, so the difference between success and failure, I mean, a lot of people think about trying to do remediation, and whether they're buyers or whether they're employers or whether they're other bodies in trying to encourage this. And a lot of people fall at the first hurdle because this is not easy. I mean, as Mike was saying, you have to change culture, you have to get to the truth, you have to challenge mindsets, and also it's a lot of money. Not as much money as the penalties, but it's an awful lot of money to off the bottom line. So what makes the difference between success and failure? And as I say, Ben and I have worked on a number of these, and I think determination and persuasive skills are absolutely key. So within the management, amongst the buyers, with any consultants that you're using, determination, persuasive skills, and a kind of fundamental belief that it is possible to sort this out. This is not impossible. It's perfectly possible to sort it out. Ability to leap over cultural barriers. I mean, I'm afraid to say that the CBP stick is very effective, and I think has begun this domino effect in Malaysia and elsewhere. To a lesser extent, modern slavery legislation, and we do actually have one quite large case ongoing at the moment, which is prompted by UK modern slavery legislation. It's very important also for successful remediation for open lines of communication to remain with workers, so that workers understand what's happening. There aren't any misunderstandings. They know what the money's for. They know how much they're going to get. They know when they're going to get it. They understand why different people have different amounts of money. And if they're confused, worried in any way, they have a number they can call to sort it out. Because otherwise, you can imagine how confusing this could be for people, and people who are in a state of exploitation, and they might often fear that there's some hidden agenda, and it might actually, it can cause even more trouble. So open lines of communication with workers are vital. Another thing which is hugely successful is unwavering customer support. Now, if customers can remain resolute behind remediation and support their suppliers through this journey, then that makes a massive difference. Cutting and running, obviously, when there is a CBP issue, you can't continue to buy, and that wouldn't be legal. But ongoing support, ongoing communication from customers is incredibly important, because it helps pull companies through. And then the last point, with COVID, obviously, it's harder to get about. It's harder. There are lots of movement restriction orders, etc., etc., etc. But we are finding that all of this, the worker consultation elements and the negotiation, can be done remotely. So it's perfectly possible. One mustn't allow COVID to be used as an excuse not to move forward on this. And I think that we are facing a kind of golden opportunity to right a really quite significant wrong. And if all the people on this call only were to put their shoulders to the wheel, I think a lot of good could be done. Now, that was kind of all we were going to say, and then we were going to open up to questions. And my colleague Ali, I know I've been seeing some questions pop up as we've been talking. My colleague Ali is going to kind of try and kind of lead that process. So over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Rosie, and to Ben for the presentation, and a special thank you to Mike as well for being so frank and honest with his discussions there with Rosie about the WRP case. The first question that's sort of come in, that's a very interesting one, goes back to an earlier slide around the different nationalities that pay fees and the variance between those. So the question here is, why are Bangladeshis paying much more in terms of fees compared to other countries? And I think there's a larger question here around, why is there such a massive variance across the different nationalities as well?
Ben, do you want to leap in or shall I?
Sure. So it's a very interesting question. I mean, the primary reason why fees are paid in the first place is because of the existence of effectively industries, whole industries of recruitment agencies, as well as informal industries underneath them of sub-agents and more sub-agents, and then people they tell by word of mouth. The more established these kind of industries are in each country, then the more ways they will find to exploit workers and the more they will be able to charge. Let's remember this stems from an abuse of vulnerability in the first place. So this tends to be more apparent where there is higher rates of unemployment or perhaps lower working wages in a given country. So basically you'll have situations where candidates are literally lining up to pay $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in order to get a job. And if they don't pay, the next person in line behind them will. So it just depends how well established these industries of middlemen are in each country.
Ben, could you just compare $4,000 with the average weekly wage or monthly wage of one of these workers in Malaysia?
So in Malaysia, it is, I believe, about 1,200 ringgit per month. So that's perhaps £200 per month or so, or at least it was middle of last year. So £200 a month, that's roughly what, $300 a month. It will take them, you know, working at a serious pace and putting all of that money to repaying these fees and the loans. It will take them years and years and years to pay this off. So often they'll remain in debt. But very often we find that the workers take these jobs, even though they know that they'll lose out overall, and they'll take the job simply because they need to be providing some form of income for their family.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. I think there's the next question is sort of hanging on that around the repayment of fees is, in these cases, and also I think in terms of more thinking about it as a broader subject, who is actually repaying these fees? Is it the employer, or is there an expectance on the end customer or the brand that's buying that good to also contribute to the payment as well? I know at the end there was a slide that was left around unwavering customer support. From your experience, Ben and Rosie, do you think that this customer support extends to financial contributions to reimbursement as well?
Well, Ben, I'll leave that to you to start on that one.
So it can be varied. I would say that often it will be, what is the most common is what is known as the employer pays principle. So this is whereby the employer themselves takes full responsibility. So that would be, you know, the factory in question, for example, or the company that has hired the workers via unethical means, and they would therefore be liable for the lack of due diligence that has occurred during the recruitment process. That is the principle that we would generally support. However, we have seen that some companies now are starting to move to what's known as equitable burden. So this would be where buyers actually support the initial repayment of historic fees, perhaps on a 50-50 basis. And that can be a really good catalyst to get past the first huge financial hurdle, as well as showing buyer support of the process. What we would eventually want a model like that to move towards is an employer pays principle, where once that first hurdle, the first catalyst is completed, that the employer then takes full responsibility for remediation of future payments, of future payments which do occur, and prevention of any future payments being made in ongoing recruitment.
It has to be said, I think. Yeah, Mike, go.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here. So it's a really good point. When we were going through our various audits prior to the WRO, it was pretty rare for our customers to mention that we had to go through a remediation process with our employers or employees. And of all the customers that we've had over the years, I think only one was not wanting to buy from us. After the WR hit, and once we agreed to remediate our employees, I did talk to my customers and ask for them to share in the cost, and wasn't a lot of excitement about that. So we're not seeing our customers wanting to pitch in voluntarily. Of course, they're not only any requirement to do so, but so far nobody's pitching in. Eventually, once everybody has paid these fees, the overall general price of the product will go up to account for them, but there's no direct sharing amongst customers. And if you ask your customers to do it, you'll probably, they might say, well, somebody else can, but we can't.
Yeah, I have to say that in our experience in FMCG, in consumer products, where you tend to have a lot of customers taking small percentages, there seems to be very little appetite for sharing. But there is some appetite sometimes for customers to support things like verification costs, things like that, but not really for the quantum. In other industries, for example, construction, marine construction, things like that, where maybe a group of workers are working exclusively on a project for a particular customer, then there seems to be more appetite for a bit more sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you all for the very detailed answers. The next one is a direct question for Mike, actually, and I think this is more around, from your experience over the last sort of 10 to 12 months, what words of advice would you have for other companies that are in similar positions to WRP now, but also those that maybe operate in very similar circumstances to WRP and are at risk of falling into the traps of the WRO themselves? What kind of words of wisdom would you have?
I would study the various indicators of forced labor, measure yourself against those, know that CPB is measuring you against those, and that any moment without notice or warning, you could be on WRO yourself. The cost of getting off WRO and living through WRO is, I haven't done the math, 20, 30, 40 times more expensive than preventing a WRO. So make sure your house is in order, and know that since 2015, when the law was modified, CPB has a lot of flexibility. Consider this. Right now, there's a massive glove shortage around the world and in the United States. Prices are high, stocks are low, everybody's scrambling for inventory. And even in the face of that, CPB just put a glove company, the largest glove company in the world, on WRO. So they are not afraid of the negative impacts. They're very serious about their work.
Thank you very much for that, Mike. Rosie, Ben, I don't know if you've got any words of wisdom from our side as well to add on to that at all.
Yeah, I have. I know it's really hard, but when you have a critical audit, rather than trying to explain it away, think very, very, very hard about it, because the audit will probably only have lifted a tiny corner on the real picture of the way that the company is operating, in this case, the way the company is hiring workers, the way the company is working with its agents. And I think having a long, hard, truthful look, and probably hiring local consultants who can interview workers and give you an idea of the size of the liability is very, very important, because I think having it, unfortunately, the current cat and mouse game means that an unpleasant audit is done, the company that the audit is done on tries to push back and reject the findings, either successfully or unsuccessfully, and nothing much is done, which I think then means that proper consideration of actually, where are we on those 11 indicators of forced labour? And it's better to have that as a self-reflection and to take control, as Mike was saying, than to have it rammed down your throat. That would be what I would say.
Rosie, I'll add to that because it's a great point. We've had a lot of audits prior to the WRO, and we passed a lot of audits. We had a lot of good marks. We had no idea that they weren't properly preparing us for what was in front of us. So another word of advice would be to hire some really tough auditors. Don't hire the soft ones, because you could end up, you might save money in the front. You'll end up not saving money at all if you go through the ordeal that we went through.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you both for those. There's a couple of questions here for those that maybe want to dig a little bit deeper into this. Ben, from your side, what are the kind of best open source pieces of information out there on the net that people can look at how much fees are paid around the world? So is there something on the ILO or other places where people can dig a little bit deeper into the granular side of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ILO is a really good source of information globally for these kinds of things. The RBA, the Responsible Business Alliance, as well, has some really good figures on these. And if you'd like to learn a bit more, and perhaps I can share some links via email, feel free to contact after this, and we can point you in the right direction.
Great. Thank you, Ben. There's a couple of questions coming in around actually how you approach this subject with different factory management as well. So it's a two-parter. There's one around how do you advise on leading questions with the factory management. So this is around actually identifying that workers have paid fees. But then the follow-up question from that is what kind of talking points and arguments are the most effective and impactful for persuading these factory management to actually commit to reimbursing fees?
I'll jump in just on the first question. I mean, it is absolutely the case that I have never come across a worker from Bangladesh going overseas who has not paid fees. I think the leading question is, do you have migrant workers from overseas? Because if you do, unless you have done something spectacular, you're going to have this problem. And if a company has done something spectacular, they should be willing to share that. So I think that is the risk question. It's the only question that you need to ask, in my view. Then obviously you need to get digging about how much, how many, when, how did it work. But we actually do find, as Ben was saying, a remarkable similarity in there's very little imagination in exploitation. I mean, it's actually quite dull how people exploit each other in exactly the same ways in different contexts, to different extents, obviously with the Bangladeshi question. But I think the very fact that there are foreign migrants in a workplace means that the risk of recruitment fees, so I'm talking about in Southeast Asia and across the Gulf, the risk of recruitment fees is almost 100%. Ben, am I mad or right?
No, completely correct, completely correct. And where we do find that the figures of workers reporting fees is less than 100%, this is virtually universally due to coercion and intimidation by recruitment agencies or by the companies themselves. Sadly, this is still a very, very common practice. And even though our worker interviewers are highly trained at realizing when these situations are occurring, workers will still feel very often that they're not able to share the fees that they've paid during their recruitment journey, because it's been so ingrained into them that if they share those figures, they'll lose their job, unfortunately.
But Ben, how do you persuade people to reimburse?
So persuading management can be very difficult, very difficult indeed. So the kinds of arguments you need to use is exactly what Mike has said. You know, this will cost a lot of money in the short term, but in the long term, this will ultimately save a lot of money compared to hiding the issues for ages and ages and ultimately them being discovered, perhaps in a very public way, as may occur with a WRO being placed by the CVP. The other thing to consider is think about the worker testimonies that we've discovered, and we put a few slides back. The workers feel extremely happy, surprised, and energized to work for this company. And some of our work around the world has shown just how much of an improvement in productivity that those increases in satisfaction and feeling of respect can have on the workforce.
And I think finally, these days, it's incredibly easy for stories to emerge into the press, and for activists to gain access to information to workers. In this day of WhatsApp, there is no such thing as a closed door. So it's only a matter of time before the sector that a company happens to work in, their information will come into the public domain, causing huge embarrassment. Clearly, the role of the customer is also very important. We think that if you have more than 40% of the customers by value supporting reimbursement, most factories will find a way to reimburse. Most employers will find a way to reimburse. So I think it's a real one for collaboration.
Brilliant. Thank you all for that. A very good point to end on as well. I think we've just about run out of time, but thank you to everyone for the great questions, some really, really detailed ones and some really interesting points as well. Ben, Rosie, I'll hand back to you to just close out to thank everyone.
I'll just quickly say, I know we haven't got to all the questions, but I know it's very late for some of you who are joining from Asia. Many, many thanks. Please do, see the email addresses there. Please do reach out to any of us, and we will do our best to answer your questions on this topic. And just to say, if you have colleagues who would be interested in this webinar, we're actually running it again tomorrow morning. What time is that on, Ben?
So that's 9 a.m. UK time tomorrow morning.
But Mike won't be joining us because he'll be well asleep, I think, at that point. So yes. Thank you so much. Mike, a parting shot from you. What would you say to the assembled company?
Best of luck. Don't give up. This is a worthy cause. It's the correct thing to do. So keep the pressure on so that we can eliminate this around the world.
Thank you so much, Mike, for giving up your time and getting a lovely WRP background. It's fantastic. Very good indeed. Ben, okay, parting shot from Ben.
Just want to thank everybody for your very good questions. And as Mike said, please keep up the efforts around the world. As we're seeing in the news, more and more, this is being uncovered. Workers are coming forward and testifying against the exploitative recruitment journeys that they've had. This is more and more in the public eye than ever before. So please do speak to your within your own companies, with your clients, with your suppliers about how to address this and how to remediate this in as collaborative a way as possible.
Many thanks and goodbye.